Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm Skyline Properties designated broker, and I'm here today with Melissa Helland.
Hi there, I'm Melissa Helland, Assistant Branch Manager at the Bellevue office.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about working with a buyer when you are writing up your offer. Our forms are going to be changing on August 17th, and that includes the purchase and sale agreement. And you're going to be seeing listings that won't necessarily show how much buyer brokerage compensation is going to be offered by the seller. So we want to talk about what you might do in various scenarios when you're writing up your offer. So we're not going to go through the entire offer here. We are instead, though, going to move right on down to line number 17, which is the buyer brokerage compensation. Okay, and you're going to see here, we've got this first line is A. That's the seller's offer. Now, if you haven't already watched our listing agreement video, you should do that. Go back to that one because it talks about the various things that the seller can offer and this is what's going to show up in the listing when you're looking at the listing online. In the past, you're used to seeing a SOC or a BBC. That's the amount the seller is willing to pay the buyer's broker. Okay, or back in the old days, the selling office. So this is the seller's offer, if any. It could say, it could say 2.5%. On the listing, you would put 2.5% right here on the seller's offer. It could say request in offer, which means that the seller's not necessarily offering anything. Put request in offer here. And finally, it could say none, and you would put none in this line. Okay, so the seller, it says if any, but that's a little misleading in that the seller is either offering something or nothing. And it could be that they're hiding what they're offering. So you've got a specific amount they're offering. It could be that they are willing to offer, but they're hiding it, or it could be none, meaning they really would rather not pay any commission. So you'd put that in here. But then the important part is to go on to the next section. And this is what is your buyer willing to, or excuse me, what are you asking the seller to pay the buyer broker?
Okay.
If it's 2.5%, you just put 2.5% here. It's real easy.
Okay.
So Melissa, what would happen here if it said request in offer?
So request an offer, I would put, I would
call the listing agent.
Yeah, call the listing agent, try to, figure out where the sellers are at, if they're willing to, like, what they're willing to pay. And you're basically negotiating over the phone, and trying to figure out what that sweet spot is where the seller is comfortable paying the buyer broker, and what amount that is, be it 2% or 2.5%. But that amount, then after we kind of verbally negotiate, I would put in line 17, say we agreed on 2%.
Yeah,
So is
perfect.
that kind of the way it's going to work?
Yeah, so you're not going to know up front. It's not going to be published on the MLS. A lot of the listing brokers work for firms that are realtor firms, and some of those realtor firms are going to abide by the NAR settlement that says that they can't publish the amount of compensation they're offering the buyer broker, and the buyer needs to negotiate it. So this is where we negotiate it right here. So it helps with negotiations if you already have a decent idea of what the seller was willing to offer. Anyway, so I'd call the listing broker. So yep, you're spot on.
Okay.
Okay. Now the other option, if it said none in A, what you going to do then, Melissa?
I'm still gonna pick up the phone and talk to the listing broker. I would like to, because my buyer is limited, you know, they have a down payment, they have closing costs. They're limited to the additional amount that they can pay me that in our agreement in our BBSA Form 41. And I would still, even if it said none, I would still try to talk to the listing broker to have them go back to the seller and kind of explain where my buyers are at, and get them to the point where they could at least compensate them, or meet the buyer broker for some of something.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So say your buyer has agreed to pay you 2.5% on their buyer brokerage services agreement, and they want you to receive that amount, but the seller isn't willing to pay anything. The other side is, again, the buyer can't pay that amount. They don't have the extra money, like you were saying. Then you can put it here. What could happen is the seller could then turn around and counter offer there. They could scratch out your 2.5%, and maybe they had change of heart and they're not going to go 0, but they'll at least go 1%. They could write in 1%. Then it's a discussion for you, the buyer broker, and your client to discuss that. You know, is your buyer going to pay you additional amount, or are you going to release your buyer from that amount? You'll just take the 1% that is offered. These are all challenging conversations. They're going to be different with every single buyer and every single transaction, but it's something to be mentally prepared for, that you could, if you write in something here that is not what the seller had intended, you could get into a counteroffer negotiation there. Now, moving on to the next box where it says addendum for buyer credit. We're going to do a separate video for the buyer brokerage services agreement. I recommend you watch that. But within that, it actually says that if your buyer is offering a certain amount and the seller offers more, your buyer automatically gets the additional amount. Okay, so they can use it as a credit. So say your buyer's offering 3% to you, the seller is offering 2.5%, and you do 2.5% right here. Or excuse me, I did that backwards. The buyer's offering 2.5% and the seller offers 3%. There's going to be a 0.5% difference, and that becomes automatically a buyer credit. So here you would put in the 3% amount to be paid by seller, because that's what the seller is offering. But your buyer had agreed to 2.5%, and they're rewarded for being loyal to you and offering you anything at all. And so you check the addendum for buyer credit, and then that's going to be handled on Form 41C, where you will actually put in that your buyer will receive the other 0.5% towards their closing costs. So it's a win for your buyer. And that is part of the negotiation with your buyer on the buyer brokerage services agreement, to let them know that, hey, if the seller is offering more than what you offer me, you get that as a credit. So there's it's just one more reason for them to agree to fill in a number on the buyer brokerage services agreement.
So what if my buyer is so impressed with we've been working together for 6 months, they actually want me, even though my buyer broker services agreement has 2.5 and the seller's offering 3%, and the buyer wants me to have that 3%. Is that something that can be done, or?
It can. So you'd use Form 41A, and you would change the terms of your Form 41 using Form 41A. 41A is the place to make that change.
Okay.
And you would just, there's an other line in there, and it can say that that the buyer credit shall actually go to the buyer broker as additional compensation, something to that effect. Good question. Okay. Any other quick questions here on this section?
No.
Okay, so we encourage you to call your manager if you have any questions about how to fill this in. But But I think it's fairly simple, but it really does, there's going to be more communicating with a listing broker than maybe you've done in the past. If they don't tell you how much is involved. So don't, it's a skill you may want to learn if you haven't had it in the past, and that's calling the listing broker and talking to them. Okay. So otherwise, like I say, give us a holler if you have any questions on this. That's it for this one, and look for our other videos on the listing agreement, working with sellers on this, and also on the buyer brokerage services agreement, the Form 41 that you have to sign by law with your buyer these days.